Well, I have to tell you, in getting ready to do this, I did think a lot about some things over about a 3-decade period, and some of them were, really warm memories, and some of them, frankly, were very painful. In fact, the first thing that I'm going to tell you about is the day that my mother died. We grew up in Ohio. I grew up in Ohio. My wife is a Canadian. And so when we got married, the first 12 years of our ministry was in different churches in Canada, literally coast to coast. And at this time, my mother was back in Ohio, and we were on Vancouver Island. We couldn't have been further away in North America, I don't think. And I heard that her condition had worsened, and I needed to get a flight pretty quickly. So I don't know if any of you remember People's Express Airlines. It was a bargain fare place, and boy, it really looked like a bargain airplane when I got on it. But you can imagine I was very upset hearing my mom had taken a turn for the worse, and she might very well have been dying. So I got the first flight I could get on, and somewhere I made a connection to a 747. That's a big plane. I'm a white knuckler flyer at the best of times. I got such a kick out of the first time I met with Pastor Mike. He took me over to the restaurant near the airport. You've been there. He was so excited about, we were just talking, and literally every time he heard a prop on an airplane, he was like the dog from the movie Up. You remember Up? Squirrel! He'd look at the plane. He was so excited about it. And on the other hand, I hear airplane and go, ugh. I mean, I do it when I have to. And so I was on a 747, and we were at 37,000 feet, somewhere above the Great Lakes, coming west to east. And it hit a thunderstorm such that it started to rock that plane like a little balsa wood flyer, that you have when you're a little kid. Lightning hit the plane. The lights blinked. The overhead bins opened. The luggage started flying around. And stuff in the hold broke loose, and we could hear it banging around. I love what the pilot said. Oh, yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to ask you to put your seatbelts on. We've encountered a little bumpy air. Bumpy air? I rediscovered my prayer life at depths. You have no idea. Bumpy air. So knowing that about my history, I'll tell you that when I did get in my routine of filling in as a chaplain for active duty chaplains, I would go places. I had an assignment years later to go to Cape Cod. There's an Air Force station at a place called the Massachusetts Military Reservation. There's a Navy command there, a Navy Reserve, Air National Guard, Coast Guard, and so I was going to go to the Coast Guard. And the Navy Travel Office, I think that a few of them may be demon-possessed. I'm not sure. I can't prove that. But when they would put together these itineraries, it defied logic, how many different hops you could take to get from point A to point B. And so I had taken like 4 airplanes already. I hate it. The last one, I was at LaGuardia Airport, and I had to get to Massachusetts. Thunderstorm so severe that lightning was hitting the tarmac right outside the window. So all of the seasoned business travelers, don't you look for those guys. If they're not nervous, I'm not nervous. But if they get nervous, I get nervous. And they lined up that was back in the day when they'd give you a voucher for a hotel. Flight's not going to go, here's your voucher. They're all in line. I'm going like this. I get in line. I come up to the thing. I'd like my hotel voucher. And she looked down, she said, oh, they're going to try yours. I looked out at these peals of thunder and lightning, and the sky was black. And then it was a turboprop that I got on. Oh, my goodness. That guy was an artist, I got to tell you. He got us there. But, I mean, we were weaving in and out, finding little light spots and ducking down into it and getting over here and everything. And I got off. I was so glad that was over. But when I was there, as part of my job, the air base at the Massachusetts reservation near Cape Cod, is on Cape Cod, I also had responsibility to visit all the boat stations up in that part of New England. And so one day, I was in Gloucester, Massachusetts, a real quaint little village in the Massachusetts coast. And we were there, and I had a colleague, and we were going to go visit the air station there. And he said, hey, there's this bookstore over here. And there were people wrapped around it, 2 or 3 abreast around the bookstore. And he said, there's a guy in there signing, autographing his book. He said, you want to get it? And he told me the title, and I thought, no, I didn't think I've ever heard of that. So I think I went to get a cheeseburger instead. It was the author of The Perfect Storm. I am so bright, I scare myself sometimes. If you remember, the perfect storm was exactly that. This warm mass came up from the Gulf and the Atlantic, and cold air came down, and it joined another storm. And in fact, if you want to show that first slide, this is what it looked like from space. Can you imagine trying to fly in that or to navigate a commercial boat on that? There were Coast Guard air assets when that thing happened. The name of the ship was the Andrea Gale. And they got in trouble. They went out to the Grand Banks. And so that's going on. A Coast Guard plane went up and did a search and rescue mission in the middle of that. Can you imagine that? And so the seas must have been horrific. And in a minute, I'm going to tell you another thing about the big waves. But let's look at the next slide for a second. If you want to know what a 100-foot wave looks like, something tells me I wouldn't want to surf on that. Something certainly tells me I wouldn't want to be on a little vessel trying to deal with that. And so this morning I want to talk about the perfect storm. Originally, I preached this message years ago at the church I pastored in Cottage Grove, right after Hurricane Katrina hit. And it's interesting to me what people do when a storm hits. Let's say the storm of the death of a loved one in your family. I've often been with a family when all the siblings are planning the service, and if there are 4 or 5, I promise you there'll be 4 or 5 entirely different grief reactions. One of them will be blaming somebody. This person died because this person didn't do that. They'll blame the hospital, they'll blame the doctor, they'll blame the roads, whatever. Somebody else will be in total denial and just making sure everything gets done. And other people are going to have all these different responses. But when Hurricane Katrina, you remember this because of the 24-hour news cycle, I'm sure you saw it. Remember all the blame that went around? This was all the fault of FEMA. FEMA wasn't ready to respond to this. There's a measure of that was true. But the most colorful one that I thought was Minister Farrakhan from the Nation of Islam. He actually was telling people, and it was all over the news, that somehow in a way that we didn't understand, President Bush planned the storm to hit the French Quarter. And, you know, it is silly to say it out loud, but people do funny things when they have a storm. And one of the things they do is they blame circumstances, they blame other people, but there's another response that's very common. I call it the God is getting you group. The God is getting you group is when something happens, they immediately assume God is judging you because this terrible thing happened. Well, you must have done something for that to happen. And I'm thinking of what it feels like when something hits suddenly. You're knocked off balance. You start to question even the love of God. How about, I think you're going to find yourself in a few of these next things that I'm going to share. First of all, you've all gotten calls or heard about calls. It's the doctor's office, and they say the lab results are in, and the doctor would like you to come in to talk it over. You feel it in your stomach? Maybe you get a call from the emergency room. Is this so-and-so? You need to get down here. There's been an accident. How about this one? Come home and there's a note. I'm leaving. We just can't work it out anymore. Maybe you get a call from the police department. Hi, is this so-and-so? We have your son. You kind of walk through that in the life of a local church, don't you? The life of your own extended family. How would you like to get the last visit to the OB/GYN before you're going to give birth, and the doctor is just totally flummoxed and doesn't even know how to tell you, I don't even know how to tell you, but we're not getting a heartbeat. You walk through things like that, and that's nothing other than you're going along with your regular day, and just like a punch in the solar plexus, it takes the air out of your lungs. You ever been there? Something just makes you go weak in your knees. You hear it and you don't know what to do. How are you going to respond? What could we do? Well, the Blame God people had Hurricane Katrina figured out. They said it was because the day that the storm hit, there was a parade planned in New Orleans called the Debauchery Parade. That's like one you want to get your kids to go to, the Debauchery Parade. And so some people said, see, God was judging the homosexuals and the gays and the lesbians and everything by the virtue of the fact they were going to have this parade. See, God was judging them. Well, what about all the other people who believed in Jesus and trusted the Lord that had the water rise where they lived? So some people blame God. Now, I wanted to find out, I thought, I was thinking of different illustrations that might make my point. I'll tell you about another thing that happened. In my Navy chaplains, I had a whole closet full of uniforms. You're likely to serve in the Navy. Also at the Marine Corps, I had a tour with the 6th Engineer Support Battalion down in Eugene, and the Coast Guard. Well, part of my job with the Coast Guard was to go out to the air stations all up and down the Oregon coast and visit the crews and fly with them and train with them. And how many of you remember the New Carissa? Remember that freighter that ran aground on? They could not get rid of it. They took it out to sea and torpedoed it. They tried to blow it up. It just came, you know. I was out there that day. And interestingly enough, we were in the hangar getting a briefing on Y2K preparedness for the terrible thing that was likely to happen. So we're studying about this terrible thing that might happen, and a tanker, a freighter, ran aground on the Oregon coast. It was a potential Exxon Valdez kind of moment. All this, the fuel, if it spilled and everything, all the air assets are mobilized, and I'm sitting there, and they wouldn't let me fly with them on things like that. Praise the Lord. But I did want to make my time useful, so I went down to the boat station at Charleston at Winchester Bay. So I went down there and visited the crews, and they said, "Hey, chaplain, we're going to go out across the bar and escort a trawler in who's in trouble. You want to come?" I went, "Oh, sure." And then I thought about it for a minute. So my first clue, I wanted you to see what we looked like in the boat. We've got this next slide. That's not me, but here's the question. Why would you need a helmet on a boat? Why would you need a helmet on a boat? Before we got on there, they could tell they were having their field day with me. They said, "Come on, chaplain." They gave me a survival suit, one of those things that just pinches your neck and you can bob in the water and survive, hypothermia. So I've got the survival suit on. I look like the little brother in the Christmas story, I had my survival suit on, and then they gave me this other thing to wear that had hooks to actually hook onto the boat. And they said, it's almost like the pilot coming on. In the unlikely event of a water landing, he said, "Now, if the boat rolls, this is how many seconds you're to count before you pull your rosary beads." I thought, what are the rosary beads? He gave me a belt that hooked on, and then down here there was a quick release that would let you out of the stuff to go to the top. But they said, you don't want to get out too quick because you'll run into the propellers and die. So we're going out in this thing, and do you know where they look to find out if it's safe to go across the bar? At Winchester Bay, there's actually a place called Chicken Point. That's where all the fair weather sailors like me would look and say, "I'm not going out in that." Well, they looked at Chicken Point, and it was all that, so they went out. And so we started getting out in the middle of that, and I'm trying to act, all the time. I was such an actor in the military. Oh, I got this. Inside I'm thinking, I'm scared to death. So we're going out there, and I'm kind of holding on, and all of a sudden it's doing this. And then when we started getting out into the bar, there was a storm big enough to run a freighter aground the night before. So we're going out. There's hail coming down in the bar, across the river bar. It's coming, sleet and hail. 30-foot seas. I was in a 50-foot motor lifeboat. We'd go up to the thing, and we'd go down in the trough, and there was a wall of green all the way around. And the coxswain driving the boat, he turns around and says, "How you doing, chaplain?" I said, "Fine, I'm fine, I'm doing fine." And I said, "Where are the rosary beads?" I thought, we're going to do that pretty quick. But what I started to think about was, you find that feeling where you get, you can't even make an explanation for why this thing just happened to us, because when we got out in the middle of it, there was every possibility it would roll. In fact, you can go online and look up Coast Guard and rolling the boat in the surf. They actually used to train crews and did roll it on purpose to give them confidence if they stayed with the vessel, it would right itself again. That's a lot easier said than thinking about doing it. And so with all of that, with what I said, I wanted to think of somebody who might help us to understand what it feels like when a storm hits. Chippy the parakeet never saw it coming. One second, he was peacefully perched in his cage. The next, he was sucked in, washed up, and blown over. The problems began when Chippy's owner decided to clean Chippy's cage with a vacuum cleaner. She removed the attachment from the end of the hose, stuck it into the cage. The phone rang. She turned to pick it up. She barely said hello when, sop, Chippy got sucked in. The bird owner gasped. She put down the phone, turned off the vacuum, opened the bag, and there was Chippy, still alive but stunned. So since the bird was covered with dust and soot, she grabbed him and raced to the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and held Chippy under the running water. Then, realizing that Chippy was soaked and shivering, she did what any compassionate bird owner would do. She reached for the hairdryer and blasted the pet with hot air. Poor Chippy never knew what hit him. A few days after the trauma, the reporter who'd initially written about the event contacted Chippy's owner to see how the bird was recovering. Well, she said, Chippy doesn't sing much anymore. He just sits there and stares. Max Lucado, who had this illustration in his book, In the Eye of the Storm, concluded, it's not hard to see why. Sucked in, washed up, and blown over, that's enough to steal the song from the stoutest heart. And so Chippy sang, oh no. You've been there. If somebody was going to try to explain, or you were trying to explain what you were in the middle of, somebody would identify to a point. I was telling somebody before the service, I think it was Dan, we were talking, I said, you know, one day I may write a book, I'm going to call it The Top 10 Dumb Things People Say When They're Nervous and Don't Know What to Say. When you visit people in the hospital. One of the ones is, you always see this, you go in and somebody stands at the foot of the bed and they turn to the person they came in with, they go, his color's not good. You think his color's not good? Here's my favorite. Uncle Ed had what you have. God rest his soul. You know, we mean well, and when you walk into a situation when somebody else is in a storm, the tendency is to want to catch this, explain it, or blame somebody, or do something to give you the illusion that you're in control of what happened. When in fact, a storm by definition, you don't have any control at all. If you could have seen me strapped to that boat, we looked like a little cork in a hot tub that was churning. You know, we weren't in control. And when things happen the way they happen, you find that out real quick. There was a Canadian musician that had a famous song back in the 70s, I believe. His name was Gordon Lightfoot. And it was called The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Remember that? He wrote it about a boat that went down in Lake Superior, in the Great Lakes. Here's the line that stuck out in my mind. Does anyone know where the love of God goes when the gales of November come early? I mean, I've walked into situations like that. 3 high school kids dead on the interstate. Pastor, you better come. You know, one of them goes to your church and the other one was driving the car. And the third one, his parents don't even know if he's going to make it through the night. You find out that your kids are going through a divorce, and you think, this isn't what I wrote for the script for our lives. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Then you have the big ones, the national ones, like Katrina, like the perfect storm that took place in New England. I mean, you have to admit, is it my imagination, are there more and more natural catastrophes like that happening in quicker intervals? It sure seems that way to me. Now, I want to tell you just one more, and then we're going to read a passage in Luke 8 that I had you turn to. But this one is a true story. It happened on my birthday in 1993. As I mentioned, I was a reserve chaplain with different assignments. This particular time, I was with Marines. And so once a month, I would go for the drill weekend with the Marines, and then I would fill in active duty guys, 2 weeks here, 3 weeks there, train in the summer. And so my birthday is on April 16th, and please mark it down. So I went up to the Reserve Center, and they were getting ready to plan their trip. Every military unit has its own fund that they have. They set it aside for fun things to do for the crew or whatever. We called it morale, welfare, and recreation funds or something. What they would do is go to a Mariners game or a Seahawks game as a group, but this time they wanted to chart a commercial fishing boat off the Oregon coast. They said, "Chaplain, do you want to come?" I went, "Oh, fishing, are you kidding me? Yeah." And then I got home the next day, and I remembered I had promised Judy we were going to go out to dinner that night on my birthday. So the next time I was up at the Reserve Center, I went to all these Marines, and I said, "Oh, I really wanted to go with you, but I can't. I promised my wife I'd take her out to dinner. It's my birthday." I'll just leave you to think what the Marines did with that and the teasing that went on with me. So that was that. I went home. We're going to go out to dinner that night. About 5 o'clock, we were getting ready to go to dinner, and my phone rang, and it was Gunny Smith, and he said, "Sir, you need to get up here." And this guy, I got to tell you, he was more than capable of teasing me like that. You know, they were mad at me just because I dropped a grenade during training one time. A big deal. I mean, it was a little grenade. That's another story for another message. But Gunny Smith calls me. He says, "You need to get up here." And all of a sudden, his voice sounded serious. And he said, "The boat went down. We have casualties. You need to get up here." They chartered a 40-foot commercial fishing boat, and they went out from Yaquina Bay. And a freak wave hit them and swamped it and capsized it. 2 were missing. 1 body was recovered. And that started an evolution for me for the next 3 or 4 days of literally being the guy to go knock on the door and say, "Your son's not coming home. We're so sorry." Right out of Saving Private Ryan. You remember that when they go knock on the door, the chaplain went to this one young girl who's 19 years old. And her husband had even voiced concerns about going. He goes, "I got a bad feeling about this. I don't want to go." He was one of the ones that died. Never recovered his body. Knocked on the door, and she just hit the deck. She collapsed right in front of me. We held her. And then she ended up on a couch, and she had his sweater, and she was rocking on the chair and saying, "He's a good swimmer. He's a good swimmer. He's okay. He's a good swimmer." That's where I left her. Went to the next one, knocked on the door. And this was about 11 o'clock at night, so the late news was on. And she was just sitting on the couch with that 1,000-mile stare, and it was her boyfriend that lived with her, and they did find his body. And you know how news reporters try to make the most out of their opportunity to have the big coverage on the evening news, and she's watching the television. I tried to divert her attention away from it, but then I heard disaster on the Oregon coast. And then he reached down in the sand and he picked up a running shoe and he said, "This is all that remains." And she just lost it. She had bought him those shoes a week before. I mean, when something like that happens, I guess it's very normal to say, what happened? Where's Jesus in all this? And what's our correct response? Is that a fair thing to think about? Can we see that slide now about Luke chapter 8, please? Now, it happened on a certain day that he got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side of the lake," and they launched out. But as they sailed, he fell asleep, and a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in jeopardy. Let's read the rest of it. Got the next part of that. And they came to him and awoke him, saying, "Master, Master, we're perishing." And then he arose and rebuked the wind and the raging of the water, and they ceased, and there was a calm. Now catch this. But he said to them, "Where is your faith?" And they were afraid and marveled, and they said to one another, "Who can this be? For he commands even the winds and the water, and they obey him." Their question went to blame and cause, and why is this happening? The response they ultimately came up with is, who's this that we're dealing with? Years later, I would end up going in the Coast Guard assignment I was with as a chaplain at Ground Zero. I remember literally cupping my hands over my mouth, flying out there. That was the strangest flight I think I'd ever been on. I was on an Airbus, and there were maybe 24 people on the flight. They were just starting to fly again. And 23 of them looked suspicious to me. Remember what that felt like? What's going on here? Landed at night, rented a car and found my way down to Battery Park in Manhattan. We were going to be stationed at a Coast Guard station on Staten Island. Showed up at night, and it was the strangest thing I'd ever seen in the United States. There were National Guardsmen locked and loaded in full combat gear, parading not parading, but standing guard and doing security work in Battery Park. The rental car, when I got off, they stopped, had me get out, show them my hands, pull out my ID, mirrors under the car to see that there were no explosives. There was so much fear that there was going to be another one. So the first time I saw it, I have to tell you, I went weak in my knees. TV coverage gave you an idea about how big it was, but I had no idea how expansive it was. As far as your eye could see, it looked like Berlin after the bombings in World War II. It wasn't just a couple buildings, it was blocks that were just obliterated. The smell of building materials and human flesh and all of that. So anyway, all of that to say, I'm wondering now, what is the correct response to this? And the first thing I did was say, Lord, please, don't let me say anything stupid. And I got to tell you, probably a pretty good idea when you get a storm call like that, the first thing to do is to say, Lord, I recognize that you're in this with me. And the second thing is, what do you want me to do? Remember who these guys in the boat were with Jesus. A number of them were commercial fishermen. You think they hadn't been in storms before? Of course they had. You think they didn't know how to read weather as best they could? Of course they did. Their living depended on it. And so for them to say to Jesus, we're perishing, wake up, it must have been a pretty bad storm. And so Jesus wakes up and he says to them, where is your faith? Well, I know where my faith is most of the time. It's in my own wits. Been there? I got this. I know what to do. Sort of. Or at least I'm going to give the impression is, I got this. Have you ever heard somebody use that expression? I got this. There are some things that can knock you down to your knees so quick where you know that you have no help, you have no guidance. I was thinking of Jehoshaphat in the Old Testament. There was an enemy way outnumbering the Hebrews that were coming. And he said, alarmed, Jehoshaphat sought to seek the Lord. And he cried out to God. And he cried out and he prayed this. He said, Lord, we're so outnumbered. We don't have the strength to do it. We don't have any power. We don't know what to do. But here's the best prayer in the world. But our eyes are on you. Our eyes are on you. You think Job knew a little bit about storms? I won't have you turn there. I scared you to death. You thought, good night. Now he's going to Job. We're going to talk a long time. No. I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version of Job. God Almighty said that this was a good man. How'd you like to have Almighty God say, this is a good man, he pleases me with his life? And yet the enemy was allowed to have havoc in Job's life. And so many of the things that happened to him were caused by what? Storms. How did his children die? A storm came and hit the house where they were all having a party, and they all died. So you get the interchange between Job and Job's counselors. Job's counselors are the ones that say, his color just isn't good. Max Lucado in that same book, In the Eye of the Storm, says, now, however, Job does not lack for conversation. First, there's his wife. Who could blame her for being upset at all the week's calamities? Who could blame her for telling Job to curse God? I love that one. Job's wife comes, he's lost everything, he's in an ash heap, he's got a loathsome disease, he's got a broken piece of pottery, scraping open sores, and his wife comes up and says, why don't you curse God and die? Doesn't that just bless your heart? Thank you for sharing that. If Job doesn't already feel abandoned, you know he does the minute his wife tells him to pull the plug and be done with it. Then there are his friends. They have the bedside manner of a drill sergeant and the compassion of a chainsaw killer. A revised version of their theology might read like this: boy, you must have done something really bad. We know God is good, so if bad things are happening to you, you have been very bad, period. Does Job take that lying down? Not hardly. You are doctors who don't know what they're doing. He says, oh, please be quiet. That would be your highest wisdom. Well, I've wanted to say that to some people in my life, but I just never had the chance to do it. Translation, Lucado says, why don't you take your philosophy back to the pig pen where you learned it? catch this part, I'm not a bad man. Job argues, I paid my taxes, I'm active in civic duties, I'm a major contributor to the United Way, and I volunteer at the hospital bazaar. Your suffering is for your own good, states Elihu. Catch this, a young minister fresh out of seminary who hasn't lived long enough to be cynical and hasn't hurt enough to be quiet. Yeah. I have, the older I get, I hope I'm starting to learn a couple things, but one of the things that I'm learning is when you are nervous, you do talk too much, and you can inadvertently say something that'll hurt people. Many times in Cottage Grove, I would be called upon by the one funeral home in town. They'd say, Jim, they don't have a pastor. We were good friends, and I can't tell you how many times I was called to go into a situation where I didn't know the family, didn't know their circumstance, and I would do the memorial service. And I started almost like a routine or a protocol. I would say to them, you know, I don't know what you're feeling right now. I'm not going to act like I do. And when I did the service, I would tell the congregation gathered there, I'm not going to act like I knew so-and-so. I didn't. But if I may, can I talk to you a little bit about somebody I do know? And I would talk to him about the Lord, and he always came in great power. Now, I'm so tempted. I really am. You know, 35 years, you can have some powerful notes, but I will say this. Chapter 38 of the book of Job, here's how it all ends up. He goes through this horrible loss. These friends come and they try to comfort him and saying all this stuff. It's probably your fault. Just confess your sin. He says, no, I'm a good man. So it says in chapter 38, God spoke to Job. I like that part. I'm not so sure about the rest of it. God spoke to Job out of the whirlwind. Sometimes the Lord lets you out of things, and you pray for deliverance, and that's exactly what happens. He gets you out of it. Sometimes you don't get out of it. He didn't go anywhere. He's going to go through it with you. You know what the word paraclete means? Holy Spirit, paraclete. Could be a pair of football shoes, paracletes, I don't know. Parakaleo in the Greek, it means literally to be called alongside to help. We started after the evolution at 9/11. They started doing more and more things for the family. About halfway through my time there, they started taking them 50 at a time to actually see Ground Zero. They took a ferry from the other end of Manhattan, a passenger ferry, and would come around, get out at Wall Street, walk about 1/8 of a mile through Wall Street to a staging area prepared where they could see Ground Zero, where their loved one was buried. You can imagine the responses. I told the guys at the breakfast about some of that. But what I wanted to tell you is how I approached those people. 50 at a time, they would assemble. We did 4 or 5 of these a day. They would be lined up in chairs, 50 of them. They were there by invitation because they lost a family member. And I would go in, and we had about 15 minutes before they gave the official briefing. And I would literally get on my knees in front of them. And I would look up at them and I'd say, I'm not going to tell you I have any idea how you're feeling right now. That would be wrong. But I can tell you this. I know what's going to happen on this trip. And I've made this trip before. And this is ministry. If you want ministry in a capsule, may I go through this with you? Can I just be with you? Oh my goodness. When I think of that and what took place, so many times it was so dramatic what the Lord was doing and things that I said, but the one that came to mind when I was preparing for this morning, I had forgotten about, haven't mentioned this in years. One day we got the heads up that we were going to have a special group of people that had a ferry all their own, just them. And they were all the flight personnel from United Airlines stationed in New York where that plane was supposed to be. These were all people, they were flight attendants, they lost their best friends, they lost people, and they were all in their uniforms. And I thought, oh my goodness, how's this going to go? So I tried to find the most senior one that seemed to be the default leader, and I found her, and we started talking, and she was so, they're so heroic to me, flight attendants, that they keep their cool when things are crisis and all that. She was explaining stuff, but they got down there. And I'm telling you, I saw every possible response that you can imagine. People vomited when they saw it. One lady pulled out clumps of her hair until her scalp bled. There were people that wanted to fight. There was everything, swearing, screaming. But this group, almost in ranks, just marched up to this staging area, and they were looking at it. And they got in a little huddle. And I thought, uh-oh, what are they doing? They pulled something out, and they started to unravel it. And I went, oh man, what's this? I hope this doesn't turn into something weird. I found out later on what they unfurled. They had made a banner. And they were in their flight attendant uniforms from United Airlines. So all those guys on the heavy equipment stuff with their hard hats that were digging, and all the rescue dogs and the handlers and the firefighters and everything, they all stopped, and it was like hundreds of people started to come to see this. They opened up the banner, and the banner said, "Thank you for looking for our friends." And these guys this one guy got off of a crane. He took his hat off. He started to weep. Some people walked over with the dogs, and they were just going like this to the flight attendants, like, if I could touch you, I would. Thank you for coming here. Maybe I had another way to close this, but I think I'm going to close with this. There was one other group. The first time we took 50 people to go see it, you can imagine, there was the first time anything like that had ever been done. It was all new territory. Mayor Giuliani was on that first one. The lady got up and she said, this is going to be a real, you've asked to be here, and so we're so glad. We're going to do everything we can. You're here because you lost somebody, and what's going to happen is we're going to have a ferry. It's going to take this amount of minutes. We're going to debark here. We're going to walk there. And he said, we have some people here that would like to come with you. They introduced myself and my colleagues. There were some other professional counselors, and then she stopped, and she said, by the way, there's one group that came here on their own dime, and they flew from the other side of the country to be with you today. They said they thought you might understand. They might understand what you're in the middle of. And there was a group of about 50 people who on their own dime flew from Oklahoma City because they had all lost somebody in the bombing. And they said, we're going to come. Can they come with you? You should have seen the looks on the faces of those people. It was like, somebody's going to be with me. Somebody who gets it is going to be with me. Could you cut to the very last slide, Matt? Thank you. I've already made fun of myself about how scared I am about flight. That's me. I got out of it at the basic chaplain course. I was supposed to be part of our training. They call it the Holy Helo. If you think about it, when a Navy strike force is deployed or a carrier group, if the chaplain's going to get from one ship to another, how are they going to do it? So we're on the tarmac, and the day they were going to do it at the chaplain school, they couldn't do it because of the weather. It was too cold. And I went, oh, I'm so sorry, we can't do that today. I just smiled. I thought, I got over on them. I got out of this. Until I found this out. That was in the school. This was before school. I graduated. I'm now full-fledged chaplain doing stuff. Years later, I went back to Cape Cod, that trip I told you about. It's at the same trip. The chaplain I was replacing gave me a turnover report, and he said, listen, nothing's going on. Nobody's in the brig. He said, it's not a payday. You should have a pretty quiet time here. So he leaves. The Monday after he leaves, I get a call from the chaplain school at Newport, Rhode Island. Said, where's Chaplain so-and-so? I said, sir, he's on leave. I'm filling in. He said, all right, well, we'll be up tomorrow to conduct the Holy Helo training. And he said, you're the subject matter expert. Oh, the dreams I had the night before that happened. And I remember, it just struck me. When I held on to that thing, you know what John Glenn said when the space capsule took off? They said, what was your thought right before ignition? And Glenn said, my last thought was, they farmed out all these contracts to the lowest bidder. He said, I sure hope there wasn't labor strife when they built this thing. Well, and I'm looking at this cable that they lowered down to take me 100 feet in the air above, not water, the tarmac. If I dropped, I was dead. I don't have a helmet on in that one. It's just my little fat frame and a little horse collar going up. And I'm looking at that thing, and it couldn't have been more than that. And in fact, you can't even see it in the picture. It's like there's nothing. You can't see Jesus either. You can't see the power of the Holy Spirit come to help you in the middle of a crisis. But if you will confess like the disciples did, who is this who even the winds and the storms obey him? If you get to that place, and just like in the middle of it, like imagine Jesus fell asleep in the middle of that. Because he knew who he was and he knew what he was about.